Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman, and we're back at it again. And so now we're going to really get into the nitty gritty of the Civil War itself, how the kind of opening stages of the war ended up setting the tone very quickly for how the rest of it was going to go. And again, Lincoln and the Union, they went into it expecting this is something that's only maybe going to last for a few months. But we're going to see quite clearly it becomes obvious that no, this is something that could last several years. And so Confederate troops in April and May of 1861 are going to basically gather and travel just 25 miles south of D.C. along the Bull Run River at the Manassas Junction, which was this very important railroad center in the Northern Virginia area that they knew they had to hold, and the Union very most definitely wanted to take for themselves. So Lincoln, he approves an assault on these forces. So this is really going to be the first time Union forces and Confederate forces really face off in a serious way, other than Fort Sumter, which was more of a bombardment, one-sided affair. And again, Lincoln and the Union commanders there, they're expecting a swift victory. And quite hilariously, excuse me, some dark way, hundreds of spectators actually show up and actually are kind of throwing themselves a picnic. They're expecting that, spectating this, thinking it's going to be over within several hours. But it pretty quickly and horrifyingly shows no, the chaos and carnage that they're going to see is something that's going to be replicated on a much more massive scale over the course of the war. Because Confederate forces are going to arrive from Virginia, led by one Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And he's really one of the most effective, efficient commanders in all of the Confederate Army, right? So General Robert E. Lee, he's kind of commanding the whole forces, and under him is, again, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who's, again, one of the best commanders of the Confederate Army. And the defeat at that first Battle of Bull Run, or the first Battle of Manassas, but the first Battle of Bull Run, prove that, the North is not just going to, march into this thing and win the day just because. They're going to need a large and a well-trained army to defeat the South. Now, they're certainly going to be capable of getting the large, but when it comes to well-trained, that's going to be a little bit tougher going because, again, a lot of the best officers in the nation have went over to the side of the Confederacy. But this first Battle of Bull Run proves, no, this thing is not going to be nearly as straightforward as the Union and Lincoln had hoped. And so that initial run, I think I mentioned this, I think on not the last one, the one before that, Lincoln called, Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops for what he expects is only going to be a 3 months affair early on. After the first Battle of Bull Run, he bumps that number from 75 up to 500,000, over 5 times the amount of troops that he initially asked for. And not 3 months, but now instead 3 years. So he's very clearly starting to change the expectations of saying, hey, this thing isn't going to be nearly as easy as I had expected, as we had expected the Union. So I'm going to need more troops from 75,000 to 500,000. And instead of 3 months, I need you for 3 years. Okay. So initially, both the Union and the Confederacy are going to benefit from large enlistment numbers. A lot of people want to join both sides in the North and the South. But as the war drags on and casualties rise to levels that neither side really expected, that's going to make it much more difficult to have volunteers, which means that both the Union and the Confederacy, I think I said this on the last one, are going to have to rely quite heavily on conscription or the draft. Okay, so early on, lots of volunteers, but due to the war dragging on months, years, it's going to show, you know what? No, we're going to have to start drafting people, forcing them to serve instead of simply allowing for volunteers. So again, that first Battle of Bull Run, very, very important because it set the tone that this was not going to be any kind of cakewalk, that the South was initially better prepared militarily than that of the Union and that of the North. And this year is just kind of an artistic representation of what that first Battle of Bull Run looked like. So one keen advantage, though, that the Union forces did have over the South, as I said last time, was naval power. Naval warfare was something that the Union is going to be much better equipped to wage. And so early on, when the war first kicks off in April of 1861, Lincoln proclaims a blockade of all Confederate ports, meaning that the Union Navy is going to make sure all those Confederate ports are blocked off, which is certainly going to directly hinder the chances of importing or exporting goods from the Confederate South to Europe, which is, again, going to heavily impact trade. By 1862, the Union Navy had actually sealed off every major Southern port except two, because these two were super, super, super important for the Confederacy to hold. So they are going to have these two, but everything other than that, the Union Navy gets its hold, gets its paws on, so to speak. And what are those two that held out? Charleston and Wilmington. Again, Charleston, South Carolina, that's been an important port going all the way back to the days of the Revolution and even before, right? So Charleston, very, very important, as is Wilmington, North Carolina. I always got to mention, I went to school in Wilmington for 4 years, so has a special place in my heart, right? So Charleston and Wilmington both are going to be two ports that the South does keep hold on, but a lot of other major ones are going to go down, and that's really going to, impact the chances of a Confederate success. And one way that the South tries to get around these blockades is through the blockade runners. And these are these small, fast vessels that can smuggle goods, usually at night, that ship out large amounts of cotton in exchange for shoes, rifles, other supplies, right? So again, the South is still benefiting from cotton, trying to sell it to these European nations in exchange for supplies to get by. Okay, so that's something that's still happening during this time. And again, I'll show you on the next slide what these blockade runners look like. They were pretty thin, small vessels. They could go pretty quick. They're going to be good about sneaking past blockades, but oftentimes they could be easily sunk as well. In February of 1862, David G. Farragut takes command of a Union force of about 42 warships and 15,000 soldiers, and he is going to participate in the Battle of New Orleans, which, again, New Orleans was one of those major important Southern ports, but Farragut is going to take the city with the fleet and cut off really the South's largest city and the center of the cotton trade. So this is in early 1862 that this happens, and in some ways this is an early turning point. Not the big turning point, we'll get to that later, but certainly an early turning point that shows, oh, you know what, the South is going to be kind of doing this, hopping on one foot, because another foot, something like New Orleans, has already been taken. That was, again, the biggest city in the South as far as population, as far as really strategic economic importance. So the fact that it went down so early on is yet another problem that the South has to contend with, right? So really they're trying to rely on these blockade runners, but they can only be reliant for so long before it's really the just sheer force of the Union blockade catches up with the Confederate Navy. Here's what one of these blockade runners would have looked like. Again, they're kind of these smaller boats, but long, and going to be really good about sneaking past these blockades. Okay, what about the war in the West? The war is going to be waged not just on the East Coast, but a little bit further west to some extent. And in February of 1862, Union General, we've talked about him a little bit, Ulysses S. Grant, is going to begin a campaign to seize and maintain control of these Western territories, right? Because that's not where most of the action is going to be happening, but Lincoln and the Union realized we need to get control over those Western territories, and that's because so we can kind of surround them, the South, both from the North and the West, and we can slowly kind of encroach upon them. Okay, so Grant and his forces are going to be backed by armed gunboats, and they're going to seize Fort Henry, which was a Confederate fort on the Tennessee River, and they're going to very successfully work their way down the Tennessee River. And the Union is eventually going to gain control of all of Kentucky as well as most of Western Tennessee. So Tennessee was one of those states that succeeded, but Grant is going to kind of take control of Western Tennessee and basically split the state in half. Grant and his troops then encounter a Confederate surprise attack at Shiloh. And Grant, again, this is a guy that always was good about thinking on his feet, scrappy fighter as far as being able to lead men. Grant's going to very successfully quickly assemble a defensive line while under heavy duress and hold off repeated Confederate attacks. So the Battle of Shiloh is going to be yet another early battle that upsets Union expectations, but also those of the Confederacy. Okay, because between the two of them, 20,000 are either killed or wounded, which is the most of any battle at this point, right? This really baffles both the Union and Confederacy. They didn't think that a single battle could take as many lives or wound as many people. So between the two of them, it's about a grand total of 20,000 casualties, either killed or wounded, which, again, the most of any battle at that point. And a lot of the Union Northern newspapers are going to start calling for Grant's firing. They're saying this guy's incompetent. This guy doesn't have what it takes. Lincoln should fire this guy. But quite courageously, Lincoln says, no, I trust him. I think that he's going to be a long-term success for us. So while he could have maybe done a little bit better, in the end, I trust him, and we're going to stick with him. Okay, so Lincoln backs Grant, and despite all this pressure, Grant is going to stay as a prominent general in the Western theater of the war. What's going on east, though? Well, Lincoln selects a prominent general, George B. McClellan, to take over the Eastern Union armies after that kind of tragic loss, or that traumatic loss, I should say, the first battle of Bull Run. There's McClellan there. Okay, so McClellan was very popular, but the troops, but in part because he was hesitant to attack unless he had the proper resources, the proper reinforcements. This really puts him at odds with Lincoln, who's saying, hey, you need to go and take control of this area, and it doesn't matter if you have all the stuff, lined up. You need to kind of be much more aggressive in your tactics. And it's going to take McClellan about 30 days to capture the city of Yorktown, which unfortunately gives the Confederacy time to move their troops to Richmond to protect the capital. And this really culminates in the 7 Days Battle, which takes place in late June of 1862. And what this was a series of surprise attacks led by the Confederacy's Robert E. Lee against McClellan's own forces here. Okay. So what they were hoping was that the Confederacy, that is, that they were going to decisively defeat the Union, but they did, and weren't able to do that. But they did inflict heavy Union casualties, which in the long run was good for the Confederacy. And among the two sides, that now they're facing as many as 30,000 casualties. So again, Shiloh was like 20,000, and now we're kind of getting even higher and higher. Two sides suffer more than 30,000 casualties. So Lincoln is going to order a retreat, saying that this isn't going to be, this isn't all that much of a success for us. You need to retreat your forces back to D.C. to make sure D.C. is protected. But McClellan, he's going to protest this. He isn't going to like it, but Lincoln orders him to do it. So he's going to force that to happen. Okay, so again, Shiloh, 20,000 casualties. Now we got 7 Days Battle. That's now up to 30,000 casualties. And again, this is shocking both sides that this war is taking and costing that many lives. And so all that leads to really numbers that just keep going up and up. Where Lee, he's confident that, I've kind of bested McClellan in as much in battle here. And so, you know what? I'm going to attack Union forces that are defending Washington, D.C., which ends up culminating in the Second Battle of Bull Run. So the First Battle of Bull Run was really the first battle really of the war serious. And this is going to come a little bit later. And the Confederate forces are going to come within 20 miles of the capital, which is, very, very close, relatively close, right? And this is really going to spark Lee's own official invasion of the North. Now, remember when I said another day that Lee and the Confederate forces need to be playing a little bit more of a defensive war? Even Lee, someone as wise as him, he starts to get a little bit of, arrogant and a little bit of puffed up in his head and thinks, we shouldn't just take this defensively. We should take this to the offense, right? And so in invading the North, Maryland is going to be the first territory that he finds himself attacking. Why? Well, he thinks that invading Maryland is going to convince the North that, hey, maybe that might be enough to recognize Southern independence. And the British are paying attention. If I'm able to kind of capture Maryland and one of these more northern areas, that could be enough for the British to jump in and say, you know what? They are serious. Maybe we should help jump them in. Okay. And at the same time, he realized that there's 1862 midterm elections that are coming at the end of the year. And he thinks that this could help the Peace Democrats who are wanting to bring the war to the end pretty soon. He knows that this could give them some momentum, get more of the Peace Democrats elected, and then they could, enact some pretty serious change. So it's not without reason that Lee's going to attempt to do this, but we're going to see it culminates in really some brutal stuff because McClellan and Lee, they do face off kind of formally yet again at the Battle of Antietam, which is in September of 1862. And this is important because this right here is the single bloodiest day in the war, and I believe even still to this day in American history. over 6,000 are killed, 16,000 are wounded at Antietam. And so the Union and Confederate forces are both losing a lot, but the Confederate casualties are so high that it prompts Lee to go back to Virginia. So this first invasion of the North on the part of Lee fails. Okay, so Lee did not get as far into Virginia as he had hoped because Antietam proves to be really a disaster for both sides, not just the Confederacy, but even the Union as well. Okay, but it ended up being a crucial win for the Union more so than being too good for the Confederacy. Why? Because Antietam was really where the British government decided, you know what, we don't want to full-scale support the Confederate cause. Now, if the Confederates had won at Antietam, maybe we would have thought about pushing our chips into the table. But the fact that they weren't able to get it done, that's going to force the British to start to back away. And further than that, it's going to really discourage any other chances for future international intervention. So Antietam, again, important for a variety of reasons. One, single bloodiest day in American history, okay, in September of 1862. Over 6,000 killed, 16,000 wounded. But even more so than that, it's important for the Union because it discourages Britain and some other European governments from intervening on behalf of the Confederate side. Okay, here's an image that was actually taken at Antietam. But this doesn't just create a crisis point for the South. Even the Union has to find a way to kind of respond to this very bloody, very destructive day. Because we've been leading to this point really for a long time. Because early on in the war, Lincoln was still all about preserving the Union, right? He was not not saying we need to totally abolish slavery, totally, that we're maybe willing to kind of let it exist in the South. I'm more worried about it existing in the West. That was Lincoln's point of view. So he was still about, I'm not saying we need to totally abolish slavery in the South. We just need to make sure the Confederate States come back to America, and then we can try to work this thing out together. But a lot of pressure is mounting on Lincoln in all over the course of 1862, but especially in the aftermath of Antietam, because it's not good enough for the American public and the Union public to say, really, this is all these people are fighting for and dying for just to preserve the Union. The average public needs more of a rationale and a larger policy sense of expectations for why this war is having to be fought in the first place. So, very importantly, only 5 days after Antietam, this is something Lincoln had been kind of mulling over for some time. Lincoln issues on September 22nd, 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation, where he frees formally the enslaved persons in states still in rebellion after the date of January 1st, 1863. So again, at the beginning of the next year, he's saying, listen, all slaves in states in rebellion are freed. Now, you might be thinking, well, he can't really enforce that, right? Because that's the southern states we're talking about, that they're not going to obey what he says. They're just going to keep the status quo as it is. And you would be right? And even in some of the border states, this isn't really addressing slavery there. It's saying the states in rebellion, the states a part of the Confederacy, they're the ones that I'm saying slaves are freed in. So you might be thinking, okay, what's the big deal? Well, he also realized that he couldn't technically formally end slavery without a constitutional amendment. And the 13th Amendment is going to happen in early 1865. But for now, he didn't want to risk losing the border states' loyalty. So he's saying all the Confederate states, not necessarily the border states that are a little more on edge and a little not sure, the Confederate states, slaves are freed there. But, and this is a big but, okay? What is important about this is this Emancipation Proclamation formally transforms the meaning of the war from purely about being the preservation of the Union to an outright war of liberation, a war that is aiming now not just to preserve the Union, but to formally free enslaved persons, African Americans in the South and nationwide, okay? So abolitionists are in tears about this in a good way. They're rejoicing. They're saying, finally, we have a president after all these years, going all the way back to George Washington in 1789, who has formally taken a stand and said, we don't want this to happen anymore, right? And so abolitionists rightly are celebrating this, and they're anticipating that there's going to be this new energy amongst Union forces that had started to be, demoralized, had started to question, what are we really fighting for? Now they have a reason to fight. Now they have a reason to get it done. It's all about the Emancipation Proclamation, that they're not just fighting to preserve the Union, they're now fighting to free all those slaves in the southern states. Okay, so again, this is a big game changer. Even though it's still going to take some time before that 13th Amendment's passed, where it formally abolishes slavery across all of the United States, this is a big step because Lincoln has formally said, okay, it's not just about preserving the Union, it's now also about abolishing slavery in the South. And that's really where the war is in 1862. The rationale of the war has been changed. Now, from the very beginning for the South, it was always about preserving slavery, okay? But the North had not always been about abolishing slavery. But now, in late 1862, that change has happened. So it was a little muddy for some years for some Northerners. Why are we really fighting this war? I don't really get it. For the South, again, it was always about maintaining slavery. But now for the North, it's now all of a sudden, thanks to Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, that these people in the South will be emancipated. They're the ones we're fighting for. Okay. So again, one of the most important decisions of all of Lincoln's life, certainly his presidency. Okay. So that's going to do it for us today. As always, this is Mr. Huffman signing off. And if you have any questions or any concerns about anything, as always, feel free to reach out to me. Take care. God bless.